going to say. Anyway, but, yeah, no. But awesome resource if you guys get a chance. If you're in the area, check out Boston Web Performance, and they give some awesome talks. And it's like downtown Boston with a crazy good view of the city. And I'll let him get into the details by himself and enjoy the talk. Give it up for Jonathan.
Thank you. All right, thanks for coming. Before we get started, I want to recommend Joined In. If you guys haven't been rereading talks, go in there and put some feedback in there. I know all the speakers really appreciate hearing how the talks have been going. So after this talk, review this one. And if you're in my talk yesterday, check out that one as well. All the slides and links are available right now at this short URL. You can find them. You don't have to take pictures of the slides or anything. You can just find all the links available right away. Some SE stats, you may have seen these yesterday. They're the same ones. We run a handmade marketplace. We get about 1.5 billion page views per month. We did about $1 billion in sales last year, and we have over 1 million lines of PHP. So that's kind of the stack that we're building and trying to work on and scale to meet our customers' demand. So why responsive web design? You may have heard this stuff in the past, but it has a few main advantages, in my opinion. The first is maintainability, and I think this is one of the big ones. At Etsy, we actually have a mobile site. We have separate mobile templates. We're moving over to a responsive set of templates. When you have these separate mobile and desktop templates, it's much, much harder to maintain. You have to update things in 2 places. It becomes a huge pain in the butt. So the idea behind responsive web design is to avoid that problem, have everything, all your markup in the same file. As a result, it also has an SEO impact. Because Google penalizes duplicate content, if you have a mobile site on MDOT and a normal site, that's a duplicate version of your content, and that's going to hurt you in search ranking. So by having all of your content on the same domain with the same set of markup, that's going to improve your SEO. And then, of course, it's a big user experience benefit. By having a responsive site, it works across any device. It's going to look good no matter what, and that's better for the user. And finally, performance. If you do responsive web design correctly, it can perform better than a mobile site. And I want to talk about that with this slide here. So how many of you know what a waterfall chart is or have seen one of these before? OK. This is essentially a look at how the execution of a page happens. This is for Dell.com. Might be a little hard to read the labels up there. But those yellow lines at the top are redirects. So if you go to a browser and type in Dell.com, you get a 301 redirect to www.dell.com. And then it says, oh, crap, you're a mobile user agent. Let's redirect you again to m.dell.com. So this is what happens right now if you pull up Dell in your mobile phone and go to Dell.com. This takes a lot of time. By the time that first redirect is done over here, you've already spent, I think it's about half a second there. And then by the time the actual HTML you care about is downloaded, that's 1.6 seconds. So you're already wasting over 1.5 seconds just to get to the actual page you care about in redirects. So by having a responsive site that's being served off the same domain as your desktop site, you can skip all of those redirects and give the content to the user directly. In today's presentation, I'm going to make 2 assertions. The first is that responsive web design is not that hard. And the second is that it can be fast if you do it correctly. So let's cover the basics of responsive web design. The building blocks are media queries. So you can see at the top there, this is the very sort of typical vanilla media query. You just say media screen and min width, and this is 56.25 EMs. The comment above, this is basically saying apply this to anything that's greater than 900 pixels wide. And we use EMs because they're relative units, and they scale better when people change font size and do that sort of thing by having relative units. The second line down, that's retina display targeting. So you're basically saying, apply this to a device where the min device pixel ratio is 2. So this would apply to retina iPads, iPhones, et cetera. And then you can chain them together. So you can have a min width of EMs and a min device pixel ratio of 2. So you can apply this to, you can chain the 2 media queries together. Now why min width? There's 2 options here. You can say min width or you can say max width. I prefer going with min width because this means you're sort of starting small. You start with a mobile style site. So it's targeting a smaller screen. And then it applies up to a certain minimum width, and you add a breakpoint. So this is like saying, when it says min width 56.25 EM, this is saying apply to anything greater than this size. So you start with a small one, you add a breakpoint, and then that applies to anything larger than that given size. Yesterday, we heard a lot of stats about mobile devices and how many there are and how they're going to exceed the number of people in the world very soon. But I think a more meaningful stat is when they're going to cross desktop traffic. This is data from ComScore. And this projects that sometime in 2014, early 2014, there are going to be more mobile users than desktop users. And this is certainly the case for Etsy. We expect to see mobile traffic surpass our desktop traffic next year. Now this is more meaningful for us because we build websites, and we're all used to building desktop websites. But if you start thinking of the desktop as the minority, then you start to realize that you have to do mobile first, or else you're underserving your users dramatically. So I mentioned breakpoints. How do we figure out what breakpoints to use? Well, let's take a look at this thing here. Anybody have any guesses what this is? Yeah. Device screens orientation, yeah. That's basically right. I'll give you a book for that. So this is actually all of the resolutions that visit Etsy.com with more than 1 million page views per month. So when you look at this image and think to yourself, how could I possibly target a device? How am I going to target devices with my breakpoints? It doesn't make any sense. There's just too many devices. And new devices come out every month, every day almost. So you just can't think about that when you're talking about breakpoints. So when you think about it, you can't talk about devices, so what do? The general idea is you want to make it look good. Now this sounds a little strange, but what this means is that you start small, you build something that's going to look good on a phone, and you simply resize the browser window, starts to look like crap, add a breakpoint. Resize it again until it looks like crap, add another breakpoint. You're going to end up with something like 600 pixels, 900 pixels, and then a maximum width. Now again, we want to divide by 16 to get the EMs, so we're using relative units, but this is the general theory behind it. You want to have a set of breakpoints that make sure your site's going to look good across a gradient of resolutions, any resolution. So just drag the browser window, it should look good at every single point. When you have that in place, you know it's going to look good on today's devices, tomorrow's devices, and anything else that comes along. The second thing you have to handle is Retina images. So we have these really high resolution displays. How do we deal with serving them these Retina display images? When we talk about background images in CSS, it's actually pretty easy. You start with the normal version. So this is some simple CSS. You set a background image, no repeat, center it. And then this is the kind of the key point at the bottom here. You give it a background size. This background size is going to be the same dimensions as the small version of the image. So that logo small.png is actually 230 pixels by 50 pixels. Then for a high resolution screen, we add our media query. We say our min device pixel ratio of 2. And then all you have to do is set the large image URL, so logo large.png. Because we've set background size on the previous CSS rule, this large image is going to get crammed into that smaller background size, and that's when you get the twice as many pixels jammed into the same spot, which is what Retina means. That's like essentially what you're doing for a Retina screen. You're taking a larger image and you're jamming it into a smaller spot. So it's extremely simple, and browsers are intelligent. If you have this media query and the media query does not apply, that large image will not be downloaded. So this is only going to work for devices that actually have a min device pixel ratio of 2. And they're also smart enough that if it's a Retina display, it's only going to get the large version and it won't get the small version. Because the CSS will cascade, will figure out this background image overrides the previous background image, and it will just give you the large version. This is a very safe way to give you only the image you want to give to the browser you want to give it to. All right, let's see it in action. Now that we know it's pretty easy, let's show you guys an example. This is Pocket. This is a tool that you can use to save articles you like on the web, and then view them and use them and that kind of thing, read them. Unfortunately, if you size the browser down, it does start cutting things off. So this is not a responsive site. I took this site, I saved off the HTML locally, and I decided to see what it would take to make this responsive. How much work would it be to take this site, a non-responsive site, and make it responsive? The first thing I did was clean up some CSS. So I changed the article width. Instead of being a fixed pixel width, I set it to a percentage width, so in this case 31%. I gave them minimum widths so they don't get too small. Just keep them reasonable. Took off the width on the wrapper, so just set that width to auto. This is like the wrapper div that surrounds all of the individual article tiles. And then I removed a background. That's just kind of some setup. Then I made it responsive. Media query here for max width 850. And again, these are pixels here because I want to make this clear in the presentation. You would use EMs normally, but I think it's more intuitive to look at pixels in this context. So for max width 850, we're going to set the article width to 46%. This means that anything below 850 is going to get a 46% article width. This is enough space for 2 articles plus a little gutter in the middle. And then again, you look down here, if the browser gets smaller, max width 530, so anything below 530, the article is going to be 90% width. So essentially the full width of the screen with the gutter. And that results in a nice looking site. So let me just quickly show you a demo of this. Hopefully this will work. Live demos are always risky. All right, so here's the old version. You size it down, and it cuts them off. Here's the new version. So you can see 3 tiles across because of the 31% width. This is the native size. So if you make it bigger, they're going to stay fluid. As you size it down, we're going to hit our first breakpoint. It's going to jump and then be 2 across. And these are still fluid. And you go down to a mobile device, and it's 1 across. So that wasn't a lot of CSS, right? That was a very, very simple change, and that entire site is responsive. All right. So now I hope I proved to you that it's easy. Let's talk about how to make it fast. We covered a little bit about Retina images, but there's a few more things to talk about. With responsive web design, there's a few considerations. The first is extra CSS. People say, you're writing all this media queries, all these other things, but it's not a big deal. There's not that much CSS. If you do it right, as you saw, it was like 5 rules total to make that entire site responsive. So it shouldn't be a huge amount of extra CSS. It minifies, it gzips down. It's not a lot of extra page weight. The second is Retina images. Retina images are going to be bigger in file size than non-Retina images. By definition, they're larger images. So you kind of just have to deal with that. If you want to serve Retina images, they're going to be heavier. The third is serving larger images than you need to serve. So this is one of the key things you have to be aware of and try to avoid. In the next slides, we'll talk about techniques to avoid serving too large of an image to a device. And the final one is serving extra image requests. So this would be, you have a mobile device and you serve it both a small and a large image. You have a desktop device and you serve it both a small and a large. You don't want to do that. So again, we're going to kind of skip the first two. The extra CSS isn't worth worrying about as long as you're keeping your CSS pretty reasonable. Retina images, there's not a whole lot you can do about it, except for serve the right one. And we're going to focus more on serving the right sized image and the right number of images. This is known as responsive images. The technique is known as responsive images. How do you make the images respond to the size of the browser? There's 3 performance goals we have. We want to start with a small image. So on a mobile device, you only get the small one. We want to be able to upgrade to a larger size without getting both. So if you visit the site on a desktop, you only get the larger size. And we want to have unique image URLs. So you can cache these images on a CDN in the browser, et cetera. So you want to make sure that the small version and the large version have unique URLs. This also helps because you don't want to just take a big image and size it down in HTML because you're serving more bytes than you need to serve to the client. These are kind of the 3 things we want to be aware of when we're talking about serving images in a responsive layout. We want to automate this as much as possible. So as one example, we want to be able to resize on the fly. What I mean by this is that based on the browser resolution, we want to make the right image and serve the right image to that browser. And we want to round a bit, because if we have a huge gradient of resolutions, like you saw on that slide, we don't want to make 100 different sizes of every image. So you can, within a little bit of rounding, maybe have 5 to 10 sizes of an image, and that's going to work across most devices. And there's a website that actually does it for you, adaptiveimages.com. And you can actually make requests to this file. It essentially puts a piece of JavaScript in your page. It beacons the browser size to adaptiveimages.com or to the PHP script, wherever it is located. And that will dynamically make an image for that browser, so it's the right size. This is something you can use through Adaptive Images. You can write your own service. But the idea here is that if somebody requests a specific image size, you should be able to generate that image on the fly. The second thing you want to do is lossless compression. So an example here is, this is an Etsy logo. The one on the left is pre-compression. So this image on the left is 140 kilobytes. Obviously, it's hard to know what the actual size is because it's on a giant projector. Does anybody have any guesses? This is after putting it through lossless compression. So we didn't lose any visual quality, but we've stripped out things like metadata. We've flattened colors, changed maybe the image format. Anybody have any guesses what the file size of the image on the right is post-compression? Yeah. 70 was a guess? 14. OK, well, you guys are getting kind of aggressive. It's 85. That's pretty good. That's almost a 50% reduction. 17 would be impressive. I have seen that kind of thing in the past. If you see like a 32-bit PNG that's only got a few colors and you convert it to an 8-bit PNG, you can get from 140 down to 15. In this case, it was just about a 50% reduction. But that's still big, right? I mean, if you could do this across most images on your site, you can reduce your page weight by 50% or so. There's a bunch of tools that do this for you. Smushit is a web-based tool. Google's PageSpeed, there's an extension in Chrome, extension in Firefox. That'll do that for you on the site as well. And you can build tools. There's actually another link in my notes that you look at jkle.in/responsive-rwd. That actually has another open source tool that lets you do that on the server side. This is one step of automation you want to have built into your stack. There's some more automation you want to build as well. So you want to automate the HTML output. As we're going to see in a minute, the HTML output for doing responsive images tends to be pretty ugly. And this is why I say plan for the future. The markup is just disgusting. And the hope is that over time it's going to become more mature, evolve, and change. So you want to make sure if you're doing this markup in your code, wrap it in a PHP function or wrap it in some other way where you can easily replace the markup. So what does that output look like? What does that HTML markup look like? This is the picture fill option here. I think it's probably my favorite option right now for handling responsive images. It's a GitHub project. You can find it right now. It mimics the proposed picture element. That's a sort of a spec that's being worked on right now by the W3C. But it does this right now in all browsers. It's less than a half a kilobyte JS file. It handles this. And it supports all media queries. And it works across all browsers because of a shim in JS. And this is the markup. So we're going to spend a little time looking at this. It's a set of divs. You've got your data picture element. So this is so the JavaScript can hook into this and understand this is supposed to be an image. You can give it an alt tag. We have this first thing in the middle here. This is something that IE 6, 7, and 8 are going to get, because IE 6, 7, and 8 don't understand media queries. So they're going to get that base image there. For all the other divs, you can see we have this data media attribute, HTML attribute. In each case, we set a media query in that data media attribute, setting a min width. So saying, give this medium image to min width of 400 pixels, get the large to 800, et cetera. And then at the bottom there, you can see there's a fallback for browsers that don't support JavaScript. If you choose to, you can put a NoScript tag with the normal image tag, and that will be handed to browsers that don't have JavaScript enabled. So how does this do on our list of goals? We have unique image URLs. If we go back real quick, we can see small, medium, large, extra large images. So unique URLs, that's great. It starts with the smallest image. So in the case that a browser doesn't support a media query, we're going to get that base image, the small image. It only is one image download. Because the path to the image is generated by JavaScript, it only picks the image that is relevant to that browser. So we're only going to get one image. And it does have a fallback for old IE. So it's pretty good. It wins on all of the options we have. But the markup is pretty disgusting. So this is a case where you want to plan to replace whatever you build. Anything you're building today is probably going to be obsolete within the next 6, 9, 12 months. So you want to make sure that it's very easy for you to rip out that HTML and put something else in its place, ideally in one place in your code base, and then it'll update everywhere. There's a bunch of resources for this, for these responsive images. There's a huge number of articles by Jason Grigsby talking about these techniques, but don't spend a lot of time typing those in. Make sure you can just go to this URL. They're all available right now. There's another technique recently that came out called the clown car technique. Is anyone familiar with this? No one. All right. So the basics of the clown car, this is a similar idea. It's sort of like a competitor picture fill. The basics are that it's an object tag. It references an SVG file that's turned into a data URI, that's URL encoded, and it wraps a conditional comment. So this is what it looks like. This is the clowns and cars option. Again, disgusting markup, but it does have some benefits. Now, this is never something you'd want to hand code, right? This is just ludicrous. I mean, having this all over your site is just insanity. And if you read through the URL encoding, you can see there's media queries inside the object tag. There's a data URI encoded as SVG XML. It's kind of crazy. But it does work well, and it has some benefits. All the logic is in this SVG file, so it's pretty easy to update. It only generates one HTTP request. It's easy to manage, as ridiculous as that sounds, because the markup's so terrible. The management of the images behind the SVG file are quite easy, because basically you have essentially an XML document that defines the images that are being used. You can have a consistent directory structure. You can manage this by dragging and dropping images into directories, and this container kind of handles all the logic for you. And then, of course, it adapts to the browser size automatically, because you have those media queries and the logic inside the clown car. And it's called clown car because the idea is the images are clowns and the object tag is a car. There are some drawbacks, aside from the markup. Accessibility is a little bit rough. Because screen readers and things like that use alt tags on images, that doesn't really work very well with the object tag. You can't right-click on it and save the image, because it's coming down as an object tag. Browsers don't really understand how to deal with that. It doesn't currently work on Android less than 2.3, less than equal to 2.3. So it's not a great technique. I don't love it personally. I prefer picture fill, but it is an option out there, and it's gaining popularity. And the lesson here is that we need something better. We need to build a solution that's more robust, it's a little cleaner, it's easier to implement, doesn't have to be abstracted away from your code, and hopefully that will happen soon. But again, you have to remember, things are going to change, they're going to keep getting updated over time. I also want to talk about display none. This is something that is common in responsive web design because people think, all right, I want to have a smaller layout, I want to hide some elements on the page. I want to just get rid of some content because we're on a mobile device. Well, Does anybody know if you have this kind of image tag, inline style, display none, does anybody know if this will be downloaded or not? So yes, this will be downloaded. So if you start hiding images with display none, you're going to get extra image downloads. What about this? We wrap the image in a div that says display none. Is this downloaded? A little quieter. Still downloaded. Yeah, still downloaded, so not good. What about style? What if we put a CSS class on it and say display none here, but we have a background image on the div? Is this downloaded? Yeah, still is. All right, how about this? Last one, I promise. You wrap the div in another div that has a display none on it, and the div is display none. Is this downloaded? No, it's not downloaded. Oh my God, what happened? All right, so here's the table of downloaded versus not downloaded. So it's kind of crazy, right? I mean, display none is dangerous, but there are ways around it if you do this sort of background, wrapping a background with display none. I don't recommend relying on this, but it's something to be aware of, something to think about. You can't just hide content and expect it to not be downloaded. And that's one of the things that makes a lot of responsive sites slow. On the mobile side, they hide a bunch of stuff with display none. Those images still come down the pipe, and the browser still has to download them. So what are some workarounds for this problem? Like I said, you can do that weird background image trick with the wrapping div. Or you can start with an empty source and use JavaScript to handle it. You can do server-side detection of the user agent, which is frowned upon, but it's one approach. And there's lots more options here. But the bottom line is you shouldn't be doing a lot of display none of your images in responsive web design, because you should be able to just reposition the images, get the right size, and not dramatically change the design. So I think the recommendation is basically try to avoid hiding content, especially since you have this, ideally you have the same markup between mobile and desktop, because Google likes the same markup and customers like the same markup. So you shouldn't be doing a whole lot of hiding. We talked a bit about browser support, but what does the matrix actually look like? So it's a lot of green. Almost everything has really robust support, except for our old friend, old IE. Now, it's important to note, IE 9 and up have great support for it. But if you're in the unfortunate position of supporting IE 8 or IE 7, like most of us are, you're not going to get media query support. So how do you handle this? My personal opinion is the best way is to use conditional comments. There's a bunch of options for handling old versions of IE, but IE 7 market share is pretty low. It's under 1% on Etsy. IE 8 market share is falling rapidly. It's probably, I think, around 5% right now at Etsy. So you can add this conditional comment if less than IE 9 and just basically give them a separate style sheet or give them separate HTML, whatever you want to do. That's pretty safe because every other browser sees that as a standard HTML comment. As people upgrade, they simply stop getting that code. And yes, it's a slightly worse experience for an older IE user, but when it's a small percentage of your traffic, this is a very easy way to keep your code maintainable. Since you have all of the IE-specific code segmented away in a separate style sheet inside a conditional comment, it simply disappears over time as people upgrade with no additional work on your part. You never have to refactor your code to remove hacks for IE. This is my preferred way to handle old versions of IE. So I mentioned that we need a better way to do this stuff. There is a bright light in the future that may come to pass. It's called client hints. Has anybody heard of this? No one? All right, so this is a proposal by Ilya Grigorik. He's a developer advocate at Google, super smart guy. And this is a new browser spec proposal. The idea here is that the client, the browser, sends an additional HTTP header with the request. This header looks like this. So CH for client hint. It gives your device height, in this case 598 pixels, device width in pixels, and DPR, which is the device pixel ratio. That final T at the end is to indicate if this device supports touch or not. So this is again, just a proposal. It's on GitHub. You can submit pull requests. You can view the proposal itself. But the hope is this will come to pass, that eventually we'll get to a point where the browser is explicitly telling the server, this is what I look like. If we get here to this point, then a lot of the JavaScript-based logic on the client could go away. We could do that logic on the server side. We could write libraries to handle that logic. And because we want to be device agnostic, this is great. You're just using height and width and device pixel ratio. This is not device specific. This is just dealing with what the actual reality of the situation is. So again, this isn't happening now. There's no browsers that currently send this header, but we're working on it. And it's the kind of thing that we really want to see move forward. OK, some quick homework before I let you go. So go home, find your favorite non-responsive site, save off the HTML locally, like literally in Chrome, like file save page as, That's what I did for the Pocket site. Add some media queries and a breakpoint. Maybe make one rent image, so take a larger image size and use it in the site. And that's going to be it. At that point, you've basically done responsive design. It's a lot easier than it may seem, and you can get started very, very quickly. Some hints. When you're doing this kind of work, as you resize the browser window, you can pull up the Chrome console when you want to add a breakpoint and just say document.body.offsetWidth and see how wide your screen is. At that point, you can pick a relevant offset width, the relevant point for the breakpoint. If you have to start with desktop, you want to use max width. So this is a distinction that may be a little unclear right now. The two options, again, are min width and max width. If you're starting big and going small, you kind of have to use max width, because this is saying apply this rule to a browser up to a maximum width of 900. So if you size the window down and you get to a point where the site starts to look bad, you have to add a breakpoint there, and you want to add it for anything smaller than that, so use max width. So again, if you're starting with big, use max width. Starting with small, use min width. Another strategy is to use the Chrome console. It's very, very useful. This is actually the inspector. You can just hover on any div or span or any HTML element in the console, and it will highlight the node in the browser and then give you a height and width of the node, as well as the selector to target it. So this is a nice way to see, all right, there's an element on my page. I want to make it be 2 of these across, or whatever the case may be. You can see the width right there in the browser. This is very helpful for me when there's things like tiled content on the site. You can also synthetically test this. So when it comes to testing, you can obviously do manual testing in the browser, but sometimes it's nice to see another way of is your work doing what you expect it to do. So I like using web page test for this. You can use Chrome in web page test. Web page test has a script capability. Just so you guys know, the waterfall diagram I showed earlier, that was from web page test. So this is a tool. Just go to webpagetest.org. You can use it right now. It's all free. You set this script that sets the viewport size of the browser to, in this case, 400 by 600. And you tell it to navigate to bostonglobe.com. That navigate's actually part of the script. It's in the wrong font, but the navigate has to be part of the script as well. And you get output like this. So web page test is basically a performance testing tool, but it gives you a waterfall that shows you every single request on the page, as well as a screenshot, film strip view, tells you when the render time started, tells you the first byte, all that kind of thing. Now the benefit of this is when you have a sized down browser window, you should be getting the right sized images. So you can use this to check, am I serving the right size image to the smaller screens? Am I serving too many images to the smaller screens? This is an example of the Boston Globe, which is known for having a responsive site that's very, very good. But I mean, that's a huge waterfall. The time itself is pretty fast, 2.7 seconds, but that's enormous. So they may want to look at that and say to themselves, do you really need to have 150, 200 requests on a mobile device like this? So there may be opportunity there to remove some of the requests that are happening on that site. OK, quick recap. Some of the takeaways. You want to start small with a new site. If you're building a brand new site, starting with mobile, you always want to start mobile first for 2 reasons. Number 1, it makes it a little easier. It's easier to add content than to take it away typically as you make the browser size bigger. Number 2, mobile devices are going to be hitting your site more often than desktops starting next year. So by the time you finish the site, it's a good chance it'll be more mobile than desktop traffic. You want to use EMs and percentages. Again, this is to avoid targeting browsers, avoid targeting specific resolutions, and also to enable people to dynamically size the browser, change their font size, and have everything look good. Relative units help you with all of that. You want to wind up with something like 3 or 4 device-independent breakpoints. Don't think about devices. Just think about how do I make this site look good anywhere from 200 pixels all the way up to 1,500 pixels. And then use responsive images. Make sure that you're serving the right image to the right browser, the right user agent, the right size, without focusing on what that specific device is. And then finally, have some sort of fallback plan for IE. Don't just let it happen and wait and just don't think about what's going to happen to those users. They are a reasonable percentage of the population, depending on what kind of site you're running. And you just have to make sure you're being explicit about exactly what you're giving them, what experience you're giving them. That's all I have today. So I have a lot of time for questions, and you can get in touch. We are hiring at Etsy, as always. We love remote employees, wherever you happen to be in the world. We certainly are able to have you work from home. And you can reach out to me via email or on Twitter. Thanks. And don't forget to rate the talks on Joined In. Any questions? Yeah.
I will often get a customer that says, I need a quick change to my site, and go in and throw in some new CSS. CSS up there with lots of big images.
Ah.
Are they all being downloaded too?
Yeah, so the question was, if you go in and make a quick change to a customer CSS file, and there's a bunch of old images left in, are they still being downloaded? So it depends. Basically, if the rule is being applied to an element on the page, it will download the image. If the rule is not being applied, it will not download the image. So CSS is smart about understanding that if the rule is not relevant to any DOM node on the page, it won't download the image.
I get using ends versus font size and all that when you're talking about the user can access and mention ends. I think what I understand is that's the case in 6 is going to sync this
Okay, yeah, so the question is, what advantage is it to using EMs for min width and max width as opposed to using them just to handle font size and things like that? Basically, the main reason is because people can zoom their browser. And as you zoom the browser, that affects not just font size, but it also affects the grid system. So if you use EMs, it's going to resize the grid itself. So it handles that kind of manipulation a little bit better. So if somebody like magnifies the browser with the zoom function, EMs are going to be a little more robust as opposed to using hard pixel values. Yeah.
Is it also more for the default settings? Like you set your browser font to be size larger, because most browsers are smart now. If you zoom in, it'll actually zoom up all your graphics.
Yeah, so the main reason is fonts, but he was saying like in addition to fonts. And yeah, it's true, some browsers are smart enough to just like zoom the whole page. Certainly on a Mac, you can just zoom the whole like desktop, and it's not happening in the browser. So there are ways to zoom without impacting that, but generally EMs are just more robust to both font changes and zoom changes across different browsers and different OSs. The minimum width of Chrome is 385 pixels on desktop. Okay, interesting. Apparently you can't resize Chrome smaller than 385 pixels. Good to know. Was that a question or a statement? Okay, you can install an extension to override that default minimum width, apparently. These are good. I didn't know any of that. Excellent. Yeah.
A lot of these techniques are killers for SEO because you don't actually have like a source tag on the image. Is there any workarounds for like picture fill, or has Google said anything about things?
So yeah, the point was it can kill SEO for these responsive image techniques because there's no image tag. So Google can't find the image itself. I haven't actually heard a whole lot of workarounds for that. I know like images are certainly reducing in weight in terms of the Google search ranking. They don't care as much about images as they used to. It's more based on the actual content itself. But yeah, I think that's one of the penalties you pay for responsive images. You're not putting semantic HTML in the page, so yeah, Google can't really deal with that. And Google's pretty good about dealing with sort of odd content, so they may start to figure out these alternate techniques. But this is the reason why we need like a specified version, a specified way to do this that's approved. So again, picture fill is sort of like a fill for the picture element that's been proposed. So if picture ever takes off, then that will be a semantically correct way to implement those techniques.
I'm using something like Compass to generate sprites. Do you know if any like simple way of like automatically generating sprites?
Yes, the question was if using Compass or some sort of Sass or SCSS option for CSS, is there an easy way to automatically generate these retina images and that kind of thing? I mean, certainly with any sort of Sass or SCSS option, you can build mix-ins that are going to handle this for you, and you can write that stuff yourself. As far as generating the retina images, I mean, again, retina images are simply larger images that are jammed into a smaller spot. So you could write a mix-in or function in Sass to handle that logic for you and basically do like a divide by 2. And I've actually seen in the past there are options. If you Google like SCSS or Sass responsive images, you'll find some stuff for that. So the question was about lossless versus lossy compression. So there's no reason not to use lossless compression. Lossless doesn't lose any visual quality, so you should always be losslessly compressing your images. You can also choose to do like lossy compression, which actually loses data. So this comes into play with JPEGs, right? With a JPEG, you can have 100% quality JPEG. You can go all the way down to like a 1% quality JPEG. Most people advocate around 90% quality. It's usually pretty good, or 85 even, and it still looks decent. The problem with lossy compression, in my opinion, is that if you're doing this on a large site, so like Etsy has 500 million images, it's hard to automate. If we just automatically say we're going to degrade everything to 85%, number one, it's going to piss off our sellers because they're very protective of their images. And number two, you can't quality control on a 500 million image basis how good it's going to look. And some images are they expose the artifacts a little bit more in JPEG as you reduce the quality, right? Because basically what reduction of JPEG quality does is essentially averages the colors in given blocks, and the lower the quality, the larger the block becomes, or it averages those colors. So for sharp lines and curves, they start to look really, really bad and janky. So if you look at like a low quality JPEG with text on it, it looks terrible. You see those artifacts appear. Because what it's doing is it's taking like a black piece of text and a white background and then averaging it, so you get these like gray artifacts. So that's why when you automate lossy compression, you can wind up with some really odd artifacts in the image. But if you do lossy compression by hand, do it manually, and look at the image itself, you can more accurately tell if it's going to be a win or a loss. So I use lossy compression a lot for like banner images on a home page. Maybe you have 3 or 4 of them, and you can manually look at them and say, all right, this is okay quality. You can reduce them little by little until a point where you're happy with both the file size and the output quality. But it's a good question. I mean, lossless compression is always safe. Lossy starts to get a little dicier.
You had a text example where it was a JPEG that you reduced. Maybe there could have been another solution because it was text.
The text example was actually a PNG that I gave because,
Oh, it was a PNG.
yeah, but yeah, JPEGs and text don't tend to work out so well, but that was in fact a PNG in that demo. But it's a good point. I mean, if you have text on an image, depending on how many colors are in the image, you want to probably end up with a PNG. Basically, PNG 8s only support a color palette of 256 distinct colors. So if you have fewer than 256 colors, PNG 8s are going to be great for you. They're going to compress really well. If you have more than that, typically JPEGs are going to compress a little bit better because JPEGs are designed for photo quality images. Anything with lots and lots of colors, a big color palette, it's going to compress a little better with JPEG.
You used the Etsy logo before as an example of how to reduce image size. Why couldn't you just do that just natively in an SVG? That would be about a 3 or 4 kilobyte SVG, and it would work on any HTML5 compliant browser. Obviously, it would fail completely, and you could erase it on IE.
Yeah, so the question was about the Etsy logo that I used as an example with the PNG. Why wouldn't we just use SVG for the text and maybe CSS for the background, things like that? So,
I mean, use SVG for the image.
or just, yeah, completely SVG for the,
It would resize itself
sure,
automatically.
sure. So use SVG for the entire image. Yeah, that's an option. That was more of an example. That specific case, you could certainly do a lot of things that would not be an image. That specific case probably would have been best as CSS gradient, CSS right in corners, text itself. But it was just an illustrative example to say this is an image.
That wasn't me kibitzing and saying you did
Yeah.
that wrong. This was me saying, you know, in examples where you just have a button, like a colored button with some text on it,
Yep.
you can just use an SVG. And the
Yeah.
SVG takes up very little space because it's a set of drawing instructions. Now,
It's a
obviously,
good
if you
point.
photograph, you don't have that option.
It's a good point, yeah. So I mean, the point is basically that for small images that aren't super complex, you can use SVG, and it's much, much lighter than using an image itself. And that's a good point. I think SVG can be very, very valuable for the right kind of image. But like you said, it's not going to work for picture quality or more complex images. So yeah, it's a good point. Yeah, the question was, why is responsive design better for UX? It's easy to see why it's better for maintainability, but how does it really impact the UX? Because a given user is going to visit your site. They don't care if it's responsive or mobile specific. I think by that I meant more that it's easier to target your entire customer base by having a responsive site. So any given person, they don't care. They just want the site to look good. But from a UX point of view, if you want to make sure that every single customer on any device is going to get a good experience, responsive is the best way to do that. So it's not so much about a single person as targeting everyone effectively.
Another reason, sorry, I'm doing the short comment. Another reason basically for UX is designing a mobile site. You might look phenomenal on an iPhone 5, but maybe Android 6 comes out in 3 years and it looks terrible there. But the responsive stuff you can iterate quickly and sort of future-proof.
Yeah, so the comment's basically that by having a responsive site, it enables you to make changes more easily going forward because, again, the maintainability helps you make more rapid changes, which helps you future-proof your site, helps you support better new devices in the future. I think that's true as well. I mean, the maintainability aspect of it, at its core, it means it's easier to change stuff, which is always good for the users because you can adapt as the environment evolves, as the web evolves.
Etsy has mobile apps as well, correct?
Yep.
And so I'm curious about the thought process internally about how you're going to look at
So the question was about Etsy's mobile apps versus mobile web. So yeah, Etsy has a dedicated iPhone app, iPad app, Android app, and mobile web right now. So it's an interesting challenge. I think for us, we basically want to get to a point where all of the apps and mobile web and desktop site are all using the same data backend, so like basically using our API. And then all the templates that we're writing are using the same code as well. And then obviously the native apps themselves are going to have their own view layer. I think when it comes to mobile apps versus mobile web, we've basically decided let's just do both, because typically right now mobile apps provide a better experience than the mobile web can, and that's just true today. As it stands right now, and this is why Facebook had a big post about this. They said they moved from mobile web to mobile apps, or so they're using web views and they moved to a dedicated native app. As it stands right now, mobile apps are a better experience. So we decided to give our customers the best possible experience. We're going to build the apps and build the mobile website as well. And again, we're moving from mobile web itself, like dedicated mobile web, to responsive, but we're still going to have the native apps. And that's just we happen to have the resources, and it provides kind of the best experience for everyone on the site. And our mobile apps do convert a lot better than our desktop sites, or than our mobile site, excuse me. So that's in part a selection bias. People who happen to download the apps probably a little more invested in Etsy, care a little more, maybe they're buying more stuff. But we've noticed that the experience on the dedicated mobile apps are better. Yeah.
Is there any way to make data in the table responsive?
Any way to make data in a table responsive? I mean, you can certainly make a table responsive itself, so that the cells can dynamically resize. And that was one way that people in the past made sites responsive, right? Before things were really responsive, is they had tables, because they're good at dynamically resizing, and they're good at keeping things vertically centered, which is a pain in the butt in CSS, things like that. So you can use it. Certainly if it's truly data, tabular data, then yeah, it's great to use responsive design for that in CSS to layer onto the table itself. But you don't want to use tables, obviously, for actual grid layout of your site. But generally, yes, you can do things like hide columns at certain breakpoints and that kind of thing to make your table responsive. So yeah, the comment was that there was a talk yesterday, UI Patterns, that had a slide about responsive tables. So I guess that's another good resource if you guys want to check that out. There's a talk yesterday that covered that topic specifically.
It seems like majority of your talks, it seems like basically almost all of your points were kind of counter to a lot of the frameworks that are out there for doing responsive. Or would you say that you advocate specifically against using those, or kind of?
Yes, the question was, it seems like a lot of the points were counter to some frameworks that are currently using responsive design. Yeah, that's a good question. I'd have to look at more specific, point by point. My attitude's I believe these are the sort of the good principles for doing responsive design. If a framework follows those principles, then great. If a framework is violating them and sacrificing performance or something else, then maybe you shouldn't use that framework. And I think that, in my experience, frameworks tend not to focus on performance that much. And I'm a performance guy. That's what I do and what I'm passionate about. So I'm a little biased in that regard. But I think that, especially on mobile devices with mobile networks, really high latency, really low bandwidth, you have to think about performance, because a 7 or 8 second time to first paint is crazy. People are not going to come back to your site. So I believe that it is important to focus on that stuff, and frameworks tend to focus more on ease of use and quick development as opposed to giving the best possible experience to the end user. Because their customers are basically the people using the framework, not the actual end user. All right, I think we're actually out of time, so thanks for coming, and I'll see you around.